This autumn at St James, we're going to be preaching through the Old Testament book of Daniel in our Sunday live stream. Now, Daniel is a big book with a lot going on in it, so we've decided to produce a separate video each week to address some of the key issues that are going to help us get to the heart of what each passage is saying, so that when we come to our Sunday sermon, we can focus on the key message for Christians in North London today. Now, on this first Sunday, we're going to be looking at the first 7 verses of chapter 1, and they really serve to set up the book as a whole. So I thought the best way to start this bonus series would be with a kind of orientation session to set the book in its context within the Bible and within world history, to give you the lay of the land, as it were, and identify some of the potential pitfalls that we're going to need to deal with as the series progresses. So let's start with Daniel's setting in world history and geography. The book opens with these words: "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God." Now this verse gives us our starting date, which is the year 605 BC. The history of the Old Testament Israel reached its high point under the rule of King Solomon. Solomon died in 931 BC, and following him came a series of kings who didn't faithfully follow the Lord. And as they rejected the Creator God, they spurned the blessing and protection that he promised them. Now this promptly led to civil war. The kingdom split in two, so that the northern kingdom took the name Israel, and the southern kingdom, consisting mostly of the tribe of Judah, became known as Judah. And this is the kingdom that contained Jerusalem, the city where the temple of God was located. Now this abandonment of God worsened in both kingdoms over successive generations of faithless kings, until ultimately the northern kingdom was wiped out entirely. And then a few generations later, Judah found themselves trapped between competing empires, Assyria and Egypt and others. And as the book of Daniel opens, the Babylonian Empire was dominant. And when the 3rd from last king of Judah tried to rebel against Babylonian rule, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar came and attacked Jerusalem. He carted off a few of the inhabitants into exile, along with some of the city's wealth. That's what we read in the first verses of Daniel. And this would be the first of 3 waves of attack and exile that came in quick succession until in the year 586 BC, Babylon destroyed Jerusalem and its temple entirely and killed or deported its remaining inhabitants, leaving the place desolate. Daniel and his fellow Israelites were taken on a 1,500-kilometre journey around the Arabian desert from Jerusalem to Babylon, which is located where modern-day Baghdad sits in Iraq. That's about the distance from London to Barcelona, only there were no cars or planes to make travel back and forth convenient, and there was no email to keep you in touch with your homeland. Now this exile would last for 70 years, until Babylon itself was overthrown and a new Persian Empire would allow the Jews to return, which is what we saw last year when we were studying the book of Nehemiah around about this time last year. Now this is the context for the events of the book, but Daniel is more than a record of Daniel's life and experience in exile. In fact, the book is divided into 2 structural sections, with chapters 1 to 6 describing the events of Daniel's life in Babylon, and chapters 7 to 12 given over to a stretch of prophecies that describe in remarkable detail the rise and fall of a succession of empires that would come about after Daniel had died. In all, they cover a period right up to the 2nd century BC. Now at St James, we're going to be studying the first half of the book, chapters 1 to 6, before Christmas, and we're going to aim to pick up on the second half of the book at some point in 2021. But it is that point about how the second half of the book contains prophecies covering such a vast historical period after the date of Daniel's life It's that point that gives rise to the big controversy about the book, which is our first big pitfall to negotiate. When was the book written? The dilemma, I hope, is clear, because if the book describes real historical events that took place centuries after the time that Daniel was said to have lived, then if we're to take at face value the implication that the book was written by Daniel himself, these were his dreams, his visions, well then we would need to accept that he was able to predict the future. If we can't accept that, then we must reason that the book was written at a much later date, after all of the events described there had come about. Now this is a hugely significant question, and we're going to consider the implications of both sides of the argument over the course of this series of videos. I'm not going to touch it here. It's too big an issue to try and open up in week one in a short space of time. But for now, let's have a think about the main purpose and theme of the book as a whole. Just note for now that Daniel is written in a unique context for the Old Testament. He's living outside of the Promised Land in a time of settled exile, not a time of war, like King David going to fight against the Philistines, but a time of settled daily life in an alien culture. Daniel was a young man when he was deported, and he lived through almost the entire period of the exile. And we learn much about what it means to live well amongst people who reject your faith and yet live faithfully as you do so, as we study Daniel. But then here is another pitfall that we must avoid throughout our series. Because it's true that Daniel has some obvious points of correspondence for Christians living in a pluralistic and largely secular society. We understand it's a key point of our faith that we want to be a blessing to our neighbours and yet retain the distinctiveness of our faith through it all. But whenever we open our scriptures, we should expect to learn, first of all, something about who God is before we start extracting ethical principles and guides for daily living. If we jump straight to asking how I ought to be like Daniel, well, then we turn the Bible into a rule book designed to turn humans into self-righteous heroes. But the hero of the book of Daniel is not so much Daniel himself, but the God he depends on. And Daniel's own heroism is seen in the way he trusts that God is sovereign over his life, even when he's living a life that is totally cut off from the patterns of faith that he was used to at the temple and all that went along with it. And throughout the book, we're going to see Daniel demonstrating a faith that trusts in God's protection. That kind of faith enables him to live out his faith, even when it puts him at odds with the will of the most powerful man in the world, because he knows that God is more powerful than that. This is the big theme of Daniel, and it's a theme we see in the life of Jesus, who saw all the leaders of his day come together to plot against him. And yet he knew that even in their plots, God was working his purpose of salvation out as he led Christ to the cross. Now the book, as I say, falls in two halves. But there are many points of correspondence and overlap between the two halves, and both halves make the same concerted point time and again, that whether in the life of one emperor Nebuchadnezzar or in the course of empires that come and go over centuries, it is the Lord who is king, and we can trust in him always. So as we begin to dive into this Old Testament book, let us hold that thought in our minds as we go, that we can trust in God even as he leads us into strange and challenging situations. See you on Sunday.